Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news. This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Catch us live weekdays at 7 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay or Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Listen on demand wherever you get your podcasts or watch us live on YouTube.
Jason Furman has committed himself to policy. There are a few others equivalent to him, both Republican and Democrat. He's associated with Democratic politics, but he's, I think, been ecumenical, to use a word that Professor Furman uses a lot. Paul, one of the key things with Jason Furman is he was voted most handsome freshman on his dorm at Harvard. He beat out his roommate just by a little bit. That would have been Matt Damon from a few years ago. Jason, thank you so much for joining us this morning. You're in Act 10 and you have to teach ambiguity, microeconomic ambiguity, and it can go this way and that. What I didn't hear from the Secretary of Treasury is the risk of a real or nominal GDP slowdown with all the policy upset the nation faces right now. Do you see that we could have a lessening of real GDP or the animal spirit of nominal GDP?
Yeah, well, right now, the level of uncertainty is just incredibly high. That is definitely a minus for the economy. I don't know how big a minus it is, and a lot of it depends on how the uncertainty ends up getting resolved around things like tariffs, or whether it gets resolved. It may be that every month there's a new threat, it gets withdrawn, a new threat that gets made. That makes it hard to do planning on a global basis. And that's the success of American corporations, is their global reach.
Well, help us with the equation then, because everybody focuses on consumption. We do the Fed parlor game. I was amazed we didn't talk, the independence of the Fed here. We'll talk about that in a moment with Professor Furman. But ignored, Jason, as you know, is the I in the equation, business investment. As you look at CPI and analyze it, how do you analyze business investment right now in America?
Yeah, so consumer spending is the majority of GDP, but investment is the majority of fluctuations in GDP because it's much more volatile. And right now, investors, business investment is grappling with continued high interest rates, which are likely to stay that way, with an appreciated dollar, which is likely to stay that way, with uncertainty about global trade, which is likely to stay that way. On the other side of the ledger, there may be some reductions in investment, in regulations. That'll matter more in targeted sectors like energy than it does generically across the board. So a lot of cross currents right now, but from policy, they're a little bit more minus than plus on that part of GDP that is most critical to business cycle fluctuations.
Professor, the Federal Reserve is obviously focusing on inflation, and inflation was a big issue in the recent presidential election, certainly. Are you concerned that inflation and some of the policies that the Trump administration is talking about, whether it's tariffs or changes in immigration policy, could fuel another round of inflation?
I think it's certainly possible, but let's define what we mean by another round of inflation. Right now, I believe underlying inflation is around 2.5%. And the tariffs that have been done to date on China and steel will probably add about 1/10 of a percentage point to that. If you do another big set of tariffs, maybe it adds 3-4 of a percent to that. Now you might be at 3% inflation. That's a big deal for the Fed. That means they're not cutting rates. It might mean, depending on their theory about whether or not to look through the price level change, that rate increases are back on the table. But that isn't necessarily a huge thing that consumers take note of. I don't know how much humans notice the difference between 2.5% and 3% inflation, but the Fed certainly does.
Right. Professor, you and I think much of our audience grew up with this whole concept of internationalism, globalization. Is that still a thing these days, or is kind of everybody just kind of trying to onshore or friendshore everything these days?
Look, I'm unapologetic in my enthusiasm for globalization. It's done enormous things for American consumers, American producers, the strength of the United States. There's no question that politically it's on its back heel right now, but it is such an incredibly powerful force that to me it's much more like a dandelion that will grow no matter what the conditions are than it is like a fragile orchid that needs to be watered in just the right way. And look, there's been some feedback in the system. If we had tried to put 25% tariffs on Canada and Mexico, it would have been horrible for the U.S. auto industry. I think that might be part of why it didn't happen and part of why I hope it doesn't happen.
Jason Furman with us, folks, on your commute across the nation. Good morning. I'm Bloomberg Surveillance and on YouTube. Thank you for letting us be in your living rooms, your offices as well. Even some people in their cars watching. Sure. I don't know. I'm not sure about that. Jason, I got to go back to where we are. I want you to take a bigger picture here. Like, look at the Washington Post, look at the cacophony of Bloomberg opinion, etc. I got Treasury secretaries. I mean, I know you go back to Albert Gallatin. Forget about that. I got Robert Rubin and a guy named Summers who used to sign your paycheck. I got Jack Lew. I got James Baker and company. I mean, the Treasury Secretary is at the fulcrum of our executive, legislative, and frankly, judicial branch of making it work within our financial system. Are we at risk now that financial system is run out of the Oval Office? Do we have a Treasury Secretary who's so diminished that he really can't affect Furman-like policy?
I hope not. Scott Bessent is a smart guy. He's a talented guy. If this policy making were delegated to him, I wouldn't agree with all of it, but I wouldn't worry fundamentally about being in deeply unsafe hands. But yeah, the tariff calls are being made out of the Oval Office. The calls about the Fed are being made out of the Oval Office. You see Scott Bessent one moment saying, we're comfortable with the Fed because we're focused on getting down the 10-year, which is a great thing to say. Absolutely makes sense. Right. And then the next moment you see Donald Trump commenting on the Fed funds rate. Seemingly oblivious.
We're going to rip up the script right now. We could do this with the future vice chairman or chairman of the Fed. Could you see Governor Furman? Sure. Come on, let's cut to the chase, Jason, right now. We're beginning to see the percolation. I don't want to editorialize here, folks, of Fed independence. We go back to McChesney Martin. We go back to LBJ, where he took McChesney Martin's ears and picked them up like the dog back then. Jason Furman, is this Fed at risk of its independence?
Look, I'm nervous. So far, I'm a little bit reassured. They had a sweeping executive order about independent agencies and presidential control, and they explicitly included an exception for monetary policy and for the FOMC. It's also hard for them to do anything about it because he only gets 2 appointments over the next 4 years. I hope the courts would not let him fire Jim Powell with no reason. But I'm nervous. To me, it's a tail risk. It's not the most likely scenario, but this is the best economic institution we have. So, 2% chance something happens to it, we should be concerned.
In your youth, you had to carry water from the executive branch over to Capitol Hill. How do you frame in your head that the legislative branch, when they choose to, rebuts a unilateral Trump policy? Do you see this as given committees? Like I think of armed services and Putin. I'm making this up, folks. Stay with me. But Jason, the basic idea is, what's the Furman mechanism of how the legislative branch responds to this moment in our history?
Look, when your party's in power, you're frustrated by checks and balances. You're like, why can't we do everything we want to do? Then when the other party's in power, you're like, hey, I appreciate these a bit. I don't want them to be able to do every single radical idea that they want to do. And, I think you're going to see maybe less checks and balances than I might like coming from Congress, but still a decent amount of them. And some of that inertia is bad. It means we're not going to get done things we should get done. But a lot of that inertia is the inherent conservatism of the American system, where you don't make large, radical, dramatic changes, because conservatives themselves, since Burke, have understood that that's a recipe for all sorts of problems.
Jason, as you sit back here and you look at some of the economic trends, economic data points coming out here, what is the biggest economic concern for you for this U.S. economy?
I just have the conventional one, which is this stubborn, persistent inflation and 2.5% underlying inflation. If it's down 0.3, we're golden. If it's up 0.3, we're in a certain amount of hurt, and everything else is humming along basically just fine, assuming we don't have very disruptive policies.
Thank you so much for your interest across the nation today on YouTube. We are commercial free in this hour. A conversation with the Treasury Secretary, with our Anne-Marie Horton. We're honored to bring you Jason Furman from Harvard University. Wendy Schiller will join us from Brown University in a moment. Never in the history of media has there been a joint conversation, Harvard then Brown, Brown then Harvard. And we're not asking either of them about the hockey game.
The hockey, exactly.
Furman has tickets. You should see where they are. One more question, please, to Professor Furman. Paul Sweeney.
Professor, Ec 10, Principles of Economics. How do you frame out in the tariffs unit? What do you talk about about tariffs? How do you teach that? What's your thoughts there?
Look, I'm nervous about that. I'm doing that in about a month. I'm going to do it the same way that I've
Tom and I will come up.
Same way that I learned it decades ago. But it's going to sound like a rebuttal to Donald Trump. Every single sentence is going to sound like the only reason I'm saying it is because I want to contradict him, when the only reason I'm saying it is that's what's been in the textbooks for a long time, and it's been in textbooks for a long time for very, very good reasons, some of which were even grounded in things like accounting identities, which I'm 100% sure are true, and not every comment President Trump makes respects them.
Do you have a magnitude tip point on percent of tariffs? Just ad hoc, I'm talking Krugman, Furman here, bring over like Glenn Hubbard, even in Columbia. Jason Furman, is there a percentage tip point where a blended rate of 2-3% comes up and it's oops? Where's that number?
Matters a lot who they're on. Canada and Mexico matter just so much more than any other country. You do 10% tariffs even on the two of them, and an awful lot of the way U.S. business is conducted, U.S. employment happens, gets disrupted, frankly, to the benefit of a number of other countries.
Jason, thank you so much for your generous time this morning. Jason Furman.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Or watch us live on YouTube.
With the single best research note I've seen of this moment, Libby Cantrill is at PIMCO. Get her research note. Is it at the website? And it's titled, I love this. I mean, this is the cynicism of Cantrill. But. Everybody's going, but. Define the but on Capitol Hill right now between Republicans and Democrats.
Between Republicans and Democrats, I mean, even between Hill Republicans and the administration. I mean, I think a lot of what the administration is doing, showing that there's a lot of bias towards action. But at the end of the day, much of what they're talking about really does fall within the remit of Congress. This is where you're not seeing a lot of Republicans necessarily push back on the president. But as you know, Article 1 of the Constitution, pretty clear about who has the power of the purse. And ultimately, to really achieve significant savings, for instance, you'll need Congress. And so this is where the but comes in terms of the flurry of executive actions we've seen, and actually to move the market, you're going to need Congress.
Do you have a faith? We talked to Wendy Schiller. It's a college up in Providence, Brown University.
I know her well, yes.
You may be familiar with her. Libby Cantrill, I mean, where are the checks and balances? You're expert at the legislative process. Do the committees hold forth? Is it leadership? Who's going to do the but?
Well, Tom, I think, and this is where we're just waiting. I think it is a question of when and not if the Congress starts asserting themselves. But Republicans, understandably, are trying to give the president a wide berth. He has a very high approval rating, at least relative to them. And so I think they're trying to sort of give him the flexibility to do what he can. But again, we're on a collision course with either Congress or the Supreme Court, because at the end of the day, there are both the Constitution and then a law called the Impoundment and Control Act that limits what the president can do in terms of rescinding or holding back money that's already been appropriated by Congress. This is going to make everybody's eyes glaze over. When we're actually really talking about DOJ's cost savings, at the end of the day, there are going to be limits to that. And again, I think this will probably be litigated in the courts. And I think the broader macro picture for investors from a deficit perspective is really to get, again, these real cost reductions. That all has to go through Congress. And that's why the tax bill, the reconciliation bill that we're seeing headlines is going to be really quite important.
So that's kind of where I want to, Libby, I'm just imagining, if I were a portfolio manager at PIMCO, I think I'd be calling you and emailing you like 5 or 6 times a day. Do I pay attention to this? Do I pay attention to that? What are you telling your PMs to really focus on in terms of the news flow that's coming out of Washington?
I mean, there's honestly so much noise, and I do think it's been challenging for everyday Americans, but also for investors to really pay attention to the signals. I think, we're obviously, bond investors, debt investors. So what's going to move the bond market is going to be either fiscal stimulus. It is going to be these cost reductions. Again, that's really in the purview of Congress. In terms of the things that move markets as it relates to executive authority, I mean, tariffs. The president has a lot of, as we know, and as I think has been demonstrated, he has a lot of unbridled authorities around tariffs, and then also moves for deregulation. So there are absolutely things that the president can do that, are really going to be impactful for markets. But on the fiscal side, that really does rest with Congress. And this is where the but comes from. Like a lot of noise, but again, kind of pay attention to the signal, and the signal really on fiscal policy is through Congress.
One of the first issues that President Trump took up was just immigration policy writ large here. And a lot of people are saying that could have some serious economic impacts as it relates to the labor force, as to economic growth, that perhaps some of these migrants from the last 4, 5, 6 years have in fact gone into the workforce, are contributing, are paying taxes, and that could be an economic headwind. How do you guys frame that?
And I was remiss not to say, because he does actually have a lot of unilateral authorities around immigration too. I mean, it's interesting because we were already penciling in somewhat of a headwind to growth just from President Biden's policies on immigration back to June of 2024, when President Biden, I think, acknowledged this was a political issue, so he started doing things to really slow the migration. So we were already penciling in some slowdown, but to your point, particularly if you get, and again, these sort of mass deportations or what have you are, I think, going to have to go through Congress and get some funding for it. But it could be a headwind. And this is where I think that the administration may not want to reconcile. I mean, some of the stuff that they're going to do could actually slow growth. Tariffs and immigration could actually be headwinds to growth.
I want to get this in quickly here. I think it's too important. I've been picking on the Senate Armed Services Committee, particularly with what's going on in Europe. Mr. Putin, I got 3 members in each party. Fisher of Nevada, Cotton of Arkansas, Rounds of South Dakota. He's been very supportive of the show. Shaheen of New Hampshire, Gillibrand, New York, and Blumenthal of Connecticut. What are the powers of the committees now after the complete zoo we've had for 10 years, 15 years? Do the committees have power like, say, House Ways and Means had 30, 40 years ago?
On foreign policy issues?
Not so much foreign policy, but on Libby Cantrill issues. Does the legislative branch have the ability to legislate anymore? I think is what our listeners want to know.
And I think it's such a great question, Tom, because what
it's
we have
seen... It's my only good one today. Go with it.
What we have seen is the presidents of Republicans and Democratic presidents have taken executive authority, and they keep pushing the boundaries. We saw this under George W. Bush, and then under Obama.
President Trump's defense, this is not new.
It is not new, and honestly, this has just been an evolution of something that really started at the turn of the century. And I think what happened then, you just saw Congress sort of slowly cede its authorities as you had very tight a tight divided Congress. I think this is also the issue, is that no real party has had a significant majority. I mean, there's been Obama in the first year, what have you, but really in terms of either a filibuster proof majority or a large majority in the House, it just hasn't happened. And so I think as a result, the executive branch has gotten, frustrated with Congress, and they have moved forward.
Paul and I were talking about you before you came in. I thought, Libby Cantrill's going to be with this. I saw a chart that showed Kansas City and everybody else in America rooting for the Eagles. You lead the committee of Hate the Chiefs. What was it like to see the Eagles win?
It was, and just to be clear, I'm not necessarily an Eagles fan, but I am a very staunch Denver Broncos fan. And Denver Broncos, we've never liked the Chiefs. It's like we've never liked the Raiders. We've always been Raiders haters, and we've always disliked the Chiefs.
Did you get past the third mimosa during the Super Bowl?
It was fantastic, I have to say. It was just total vindication. We were all wearing green, so it was, and a little bit of orange, just for the head nod to the Broncos. But it was a great day.
That's good. Libby, thank you so much. Don't
Thanks
be a stranger. Please come
Appreciate
in
it.
more often.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 7 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
This is a treat. We really try to stake out a good amount of time here with David Sowerby. He has a really interesting history working with the city of Detroit, among others, the iconic Loomis sales years ago, and now with Ancora, looking at not only industrial America, it's like Canadian National. They got the train across Canada, and they go.
I've been on that train.
North-south,
Yep.
north-south down the Mississippi River, but just a twisted and different look with a tilt to mid-cap and small cap. David, can you explain to me how Walmart makes 5, 6, 7 cents in the dollar and they're trading at a 40 multiple? Please, is that in the Wayne State textbook?
No, it's not an evaluation textbook, Tom. And in a way, it's reminiscent of what we saw in Walmart in the late 90s, early 2000s, when its valuation got very stretched to the retail group. And then it went through an extended period of underperformance. So we'll see what happens out of this number today.
Does this end ugly? I mean, what all our listeners want to know from David Sowerby is, okay, we're all fat and happy in our 501ks. David Sowerby, does this end ugly?
No, it doesn't at all. Companies are still generating above average free cash flow margins. Fourth quarter earnings report, I'd give them a solid B plus for earnings, cash flow, and revenue growth. This year is the metric you and I like to talk about, Tom. Free cash flow for the S&P 500 will grow close to 15%. That's not a backdrop where it ends ugly. It just simply means some tempered expectations, but still bet on the ability of U.S. companies to generate shareholder value.
David, as we think about 2025, and you look back to 23, 24, where you had north of 20% growth in the S&P 500 or gains in the S&P 500. We think about 2025, what can drive this market higher? Because it doesn't seem like the Fed is going to do a whole lot for us. So do we really, really have to focus on earnings?
You do. Valuations will have a difficult, if not impossible, ability to increase higher valuations. So now it comes down to earnings, dividend growth, and free cash growth. That will be the driving force. And then the other, I like that this market is broadening out. We can all pick our favorite date. I'm going to go back to July 11th of last year when the market started to broaden out, and it's been a little bit of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But small caps have outperformed large caps by about 3 percentage points in that 7-month time period. And then when you find the alpha producer within smaller mid cap, the ability of good managers to outperform, you've seen returns that have doubled the S&P 500 for good small cap managers versus the S&P index.
July 11 of last year. Sowerby he has no clue. I mean, Red Sox 7, Oakland A's 0. The Red Sox were 10 games above 500. What happened?
And the Tigers made the playoffs.
Exactly. There you are. Thank you.
Hey, David, what screens well for you guys these days? Is it the big growth stocks that have been the darlings over the last few years? Is it some value names? Is it different market capitalization? What screens well for you guys these days?
On that often asked Mag 7, I don't think it's a binary event, all or none. So I think, but on the margin, those weights have to come down. While their free cash flow margins are still quite impressive, their valuation is priced for perfection, if not sainthood. So I think you want to be trimming them, and you want to be moving your portfolio not just talking my book to small mid-cap, but also to the value side. And that's where I think there's still opportunity, recognizing we're in this 7-month inflection point rotation that's still ongoing.
On YouTube, across the nation, on your commute as well. David Sowerby with us, with a great sense of the Midwest. He mentioned Michael Barr's not here, so I'm glad somebody mentioned the Detroit Tigers. No one else cares. But David Sowerby with us here, and thank you for subscribing to YouTube as well. I'm going to steal that line. The market's priced to sainthood.
I like that.
That's
that is
it's
good.
Just like you know. It sounds like it could
some
be
of the
Barron's.
Mag 7 are.
Hey, so David, talk to me about a name that I'm not sure even Tom and I have not spoken about. I'm not sure when. Weyerhaeuser. We're talking lumber here. Talk to us about that name.
So 3% dividend yield. Lumber prices are up 15% since December. That's giving them a tailwind. You don't own it just because maybe tariffs will be beneficial to U.S. lumber and timber, but that's an indirect benefit. They're going to double their free cash in 2025. So for a stock that's been sitting around $30 a share for too long, now there's this, I think, more macro backdrop with a company that's very well run. And think about it. Trees are an asset that grow. Unlike other assets that don't have Mother Nature on their side, that can be a beneficiary to a lumber timber company like Weyerhaeuser out in Washington, USA.
Yeah, it's just a name you don't think about at all. Another one that
my job is my job is not to bring you Microsoft, but bring you something a little.
I love it. I love it. I mean, yeah, again, based out in Seattle, you think about this. Atlanta Braves. This is a name near and dear to my heart because I basically been followed John Malone since the earliest days of his cable career, and he's been such a phenomenal allocator of capital. And wherever John Malone goes, I tend to follow. A lot of smart money tends to follow, I think. Talk to us about the Atlanta Braves. That's a publicly traded company.
It is. And John Malone has recently bought 24,500 shares. So if you follow the money and you believe in John Malone, as Tom knows, he's one of the chapters in Thorndike's Outsiders book. So plus you have the franchise, the stadium, broadcast rights. They own some mixed-use retail around the stadium. They were one of the first teams back in the Dale Murphy Atlanta Braves days to go on national TV with TBS. So when you and then you look at sports valuations going higher and higher, billionaires buying sports franchises. There's the backdrop to the Atlanta Braves, and only 4 analysts follow it. That's right in a wheelhouse for an underfollowed stock.
Okay, does a sports franchise, the New York Giants public?
No,
that was a joke. Good morning to the Tisch family. Thank you for your support. David Sowerby, as simple as I can, does something like the Atlanta Braves trade on how the baseball team does? Like if they win 7 in a row, does the stock go up?
If they're destined for the playoffs, and then you get the extra playoff money. Yeah. That moves the needle, and the Braves in the last several years have been better than not.
Right.
And that's helped the valuation on the stock.
Right. You and I lived this, and I think Paul did tangentially, which is bolt-ons. And the basic idea that a company like in specialty chemicals out in the Midwest would say, okay, we're going to jettison this hunk of our company. And there'd be people out there that would see this smaller company that was jettisoned, and maybe they would bolt it on. Are we going to get a lot of M&A action around industrial companies, right-sizing, downsizing, and aggregating?
It's already taking place in more small-cap value. You're seeing more and more buyouts. We're seeing more and more buyouts in our successful small and mid-cap strategies. It's reminiscent of 2000, 2001 when valuations were more attractive, and as companies want to grow, you're going to see more buyout M&A in that sector.
Give us another name right now. Come on, just like this is like Gerard Cassidy and Banks up in Portland. David Sowerby, give us a small cap name. You say shut up and buy it.
Lakeland Industries, symbol LAKE, Huntsville, Alabama. Only 2 analysts follow this company. What do?
That's great.
They do fire, apparel, and equipment. So you're seeing fire departments up their budgets, sadly, out of the tragedy in Southern California. So here's a play on that for apparel and equipment in the safety and fire space, Lakeland Industries.
It made 12% over the last 10 years, had a huge moonshot up to a couple of years ago, came down, it's bounced back nicely. I can go to the BQ screen because Paul Sweeney taught me how to do this. I mean, I look at 1,800, this is like a Calvacina stock, 1,800 employees. Ready? It's trading at 1 times sales.
Yep.
1.2 times sales. How does it get discovered if only 2 people on the sell side buy it? So I buy it, but do I own it forever, David Sowerby?
Perhaps not, but you can own it at least a year.
It's up 45%
in the last year. Yep.
How it gets discovered is the formula. They've got a good story. They get out on the road. They tell their story. They go to more investment conferences. Sell-side analysts are a little bit like sheep. When the stock starts moving up, here they come to pick up coverage on it. That's how a company with 2 analysts turns into a company with 5 analysts following it because they're delivering on capital allocation and cash flow shareholder value.
Michael Darda's shop, Roth Capital, they follow it.
Yep. Well, I look at who the
Roth
investors
is
are.
very good on small caps. They're one of the few that are very good.
And, in addition to Ancora Advisors, Wasatch Advisors out in Utah.
How do you pronounce that? I've never known
Wasatch.
how to
Wasatch. They're out in Salt Lake. They own 1 million shares. So, David, how do you guys find these things? How do you screen for a company like Lakeland Industries?
There's really 2 formulas here. One is you know with some degree of certainty what stocks are likely to be going into the Russell 2000 on a June rebalancing. You want to turn over those stones and find them the right companies before they go in. That's the formula. The second formula is you buy the spin-outs. Small company spins out of a larger company. Since that July 11th inflection point, the Bloomberg spin-off index is up more than 40%. Those are the 2 formulas, spin-offs and underfollowed stocks that are going into the index, buy them before.
David, can we do this every 6 weeks?
Absolutely.
We get a huge response.
Yeah.
David Sowerby, thank you so much. Folks, for the rest of the week, all we're going to talk about is Amazon, Meta, and Apple. We got our dose of Mr. Sowerby. David Sowerby, thank you so much.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 7 a.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.
There is a doorstop out there. It's the kind of paperback book, paperback novel, paperback writer that you hold a window open in a Rhode Island beautiful summer afternoon.
Yep.
It's 720 pages. And it's called Gateway to Democracy. Gateway to Democracy. One of the authors of Gateways to Democracy, An Introduction to American Government, is Wendy Schiller of Brown University. She's been very patient. Wendy, first of all, thank you for your patience with the Besson interview. Greatly thrilled that you're with us today. Wendy, you and I, Lisa Mateo, and all of our listeners and viewers have never seen this. Where are the checks and balances that you write about in your classic Gateways to Democracy?
Well, we're not seeing them yet. Good morning, Tom and Paul. But we're seeing some simmers, right? So Governor Kathy Hochul, I think some of you might have caught that very viral clip now. And just to see that the Democrats are now the party of states' rights and the Republicans are the party of federal overreach. Now, when I say overreach, I'm not, you're cutting the federal employees, maybe you're cutting federal spending. We haven't quite seen that yet materialize. But this is an extraordinary flip from what we've seen in the last couple of decades. And it's an earthquake in American politics to see this flip where Democratic governors will be saying, we are defending our state prerogatives.
Somebody said to me yesterday, stopped me and they said, who are you watching more than anyone? And I said, the minority member of the Senate Armed Services Committee with his military credibility, Senator Reid of your Rhode Island. Can the committees come to the rescue, both Republicans and Democrats? Is there a committee coherence and strength, Professor Schiller, that can bring checks and balances?
Well, the issue of saying rescue, this is the whole point. I mean, people are saying, oh, this is getting very shaky and scary when, the president's tweeting that he's the king. But on the other hand, Trump is excellent at political theater. So, what is actually a threat to civil liberties? What is a threat to the freedom of the press, your freedom to have financial independence? What are those actual federal threats right now? Versus what the appearances are, what the rhetoric is. And until they catch up to each other and the American voter feels concerned or feels threatened by the Trump federal government, I don't think you're going to have a lot of legs to stand on. I don't think you're going to have a lot of leverage to generate public opposition. And without public opposition in those red states and those red districts, I don't see the House or the Senate standing up and opposing this president, except they will use the debt ceiling, I think, as leverage. Maybe not in the House, but I think in the Senate, they'll say, listen, we don't want to crash the economy, but there's got to be a limit. And you're seeing grumblings already in the House GOP on the extent of cuts that they're proposing for this budget deal. Remember, the government has to get funded again at the end of March. So really, the fundamental congressional tool to fund the government, even if the president changes how he's spending the money, is still their leverage. And, 6 weeks from now, things could look quite different in terms of the pressure on them to stop some of these Trump initiatives.
Wendy, are you surprised that we haven't seen a Democratic voice rise up to challenge President Trump on some of policies, maybe some of the rhetoric? It doesn't seem like there is a Democratic voice.
Well, again, there's two things, Paul. What Kathy Hochul did was in direct result to an action that affects New York City.
Yep.
A lot of people live in New York City. So, she got a big state, a big megaphone, a big media market. So when there's that opportunity, I think you're going to start to see a more Democrats get out of the gate. Remember, 26 is looming for re-election, 28 is the presidential race. So they're going to get out of the gate when there's something Trump does that they can latch onto that won't be popular with their state. And if it's a big state, that's going to get a lot of attention. Otherwise, it's like whack-a-mole. You complain about one thing, and then they'll just move in and focus on something else. So I think the Russia-Ukraine, let's watch to see what the Republicans do in the House and the Senate. If Trump shows real signs of abandoning Ukraine and just giving it away to Russia, I think you will start to see some noise, not only from Democrats, but also Republicans.
Well, let's go to that issue, because that's certainly been in the news over the last several days here. Are you surprised at the way President Trump is approaching this, seemingly pro-Russia, perhaps abandoning Ukraine to some extent, it seems like in some of the reporting? How do you view that?
I view it in the very macro sense that Trump does not have the allegiance to an ideology like George W. Bush, somewhat Barack Obama, but really Bush and maybe Biden, of what the role of the United States is supposed to be in the world. He doesn't believe that it's worth it to the United States to go protect other countries around the world. I've quoted John Quincy Adams a number of times, Tom, right? Don't go in search of monsters to destroy. So this is his position. He doesn't have this ideology, and he doesn't think the United States should do it. I don't know if it's Russia per se. You can say he's in love with Putin, but he's like this around the whole world. Why are we paying? Why are we sending our troops? They're about to propose cuts to the defense budget. I haven't seen Republicans cut the defense budget ever. So this is a real sea change in how he views what the United States is responsible to do. Does it make us more dangerous? You can argue yes, but has it made us more threatened yet?
Right.
No.
This is what we invented, folks. Bloomberg surveillance. We go beyond the standard conversation. A conversation with the Secretary of Treasury. And this hour, thank you, Anne-Marie Horton, for that. And then Jason Furman of Harvard University, and now from Brown University, Wendy Schiller with us. Professor Schiller, I was reading of Dean Rusk the other day. Of course, from another time and place, many of our listeners won't understand the quiet and the cadence, the pace that Dean Rusk brought to JFK and to LBJ is, well, do you look at the cacophony now as a one-off of a specific president, or do you look at it as this is a continuance, a new form of dialogue? Is President Trump here a one and unique president, or is there a follow-through here for a new Republican Party?
Well, I mean, I think given the loyalty that the Republicans have shown in the House and the Senate to President Trump already, Whether that holds, we'll have to see. I think it's a new Republican Party. It's a get on this bus, be with us, or get out. And and they're counting on this to resonate with the American people. So far, his approval ratings are holding. I've always said when they start to drop, he'll change course. But it's a fundamental shift in how they view the United States power and what to do with that power. And they still have the responsibility of delivering to the people who voted for Donald Trump when he said he would make things better for them. And, not supporting Ukraine doesn't actually make anything better for the United States. So how is he going to deliver on that? And we've got months to go before we see the results of that. If he falters and he doesn't make things better and his approval ratings drop, you'll see the same splinter in the Republican Party you've seen for the last decade.
And Paul Sweeney, David Gura brought this up. Yep. And, let's be direct here. Mr. Trump got, let's just round it off, folks, don't give me grief, 50% of the vote. But what percentage of that drifts away from the core Trump supporters? That's a mystery into Q2 of this year.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Wendy, what do you think is the next major challenge or opportunity for President Trump as an administration? Is it the funding of the government, some domestic legislation, or is it maybe Ukraine? What are you looking at as a next big issue for this administration?
Well, the one thing to understand about Trump that we've seen is that his attention span is pretty short, but that also makes him a multitasker, right? He'll go from one to the next, to the next, to the next. He wants to be busy doing things. So I don't think it's exclusive. I don't think it's mutually exclusive to think about the budget and Ukraine. But I do think that we haven't seen any major impacts except for the people who are losing their jobs on a daily basis from the federal government. We haven't seen the impacts. When the impacts come, when the cuts hit, this summer, maybe this fall, when the education department cuts hit for people going back to school next year, that's going to affect people's daily lives. How they respond is and then how Trump responds. Does he think he wants to run again, even though constitutionally he cannot be elected? Doesn't say he can't run. Can't be elected to serve more than 2 terms, then that changes the ball game also. So it's a time of great uncertainty, and I think, does that affect investment in the United States? Do they think that it's still a safe economic bet with such a chaotic president? We're about to see that in the next couple of months.
I was thinking of Jonathan Fenby and all that he's written about France, Professor Schiller. And I guess as a general apolitical statement, folks, across the nation, Europe's got to get its act together. Wendy Schiller, do you see any ability in your study of our history, our modern Western civilization, that Europe can, quote unquote, get its act together?
Well, Europe rebuilt after World War II, as most people know, with a tremendous amount of help from the United States.
Yeah, come on. I'm going to stop
we know that,
you.
But here's the thing to remember about this Trump-Republican unity and the swiftness of all these changes. Europe has parliamentary democracies. The prime minister, when they were in control in the party, that he controls, mostly he, not always, controls all party policy, all government policy. They change everything when they win the government, and they see if it works, and people say they like it or they don't, and then they get thrown out. We are now verging into that kind of single-party dominance in our federal level. We're not used to it. So to say that Europe has to get its act together, we're veering towards a political system that looks just like Europe in the way that policy changes so swiftly. So it's going to be us that has to adapt, us that has to get our act together to the kind of government that we're seeing right now.
That is the single smartest thing ever. Whatever your politics, folks, what Professor Schiller just said about the wars and the roses in the parliamentary systems of Europe versus here is more cogent than all the babble you're hearing, including on this show. Professor Schiller, thank you so much. Really, really appreciate that.
This is the Bloomberg Surveillance Podcast, available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live each weekday, 7 to 10 a.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.